Racist judge kicks out. Black woman then finds out. She's his new boss. The tension in courtroom 7 was palpable as Judge Robert Whitfield's gavel came down with unnecessary force, his cold eyes fixed on the composed black woman standing before him, her credentials and purpose dismissed before she could fully explain them. No one expected what would happen next, how this routine ejection would trigger the collapse of a decades-old system of injustice and reveal the powerful connection between the judge and the woman he so casually disrespected. Milbrook County Courthouse stood as an imposing neoclassical structure in the heart of Claiborne, Alabama. Its white columns and grand facade projected authority and permanence, a stark contrast to the changing world beyond its doors. Inside, the wood-paneled courtrooms still bore the subtle markers of a segregated past, separate entrances now sealed, but visible bench positions designed for a different era of justice. On this sweltering June morning, the air conditioning struggled against the Alabama heat, creating an atmosphere as stifling as the justice often dispensed within. Amara Cole stepped out of her government-issued sedan, straightening her impeccably tailored navy suit. At 38, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had fought for every achievement. Her natural hair was styled in a professional twist, and her keen brown eyes missed nothing as she surveyed the courthouse. As the newly appointed Special Investigator for the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, Amara had spent the last decade building a reputation for methodical, uncompromising work, exposing judicial misconduct across the country. Born and raised in this very county, before leaving for Howard University and then Harvard Law, Amara carried with her the weight of personal history. Her father, James Cole, had been wrongfully convicted in this very courthouse 25 years ago, sentenced to 15 years for a crime he didn't commit by none other than a young assistant district attorney named Robert Whitfield, now the chief judge of the circuit. Though her father had died 3 years after his release, his final words to Amara had been, "Don't seek revenge, seek justice." She had built her career on that principle. What few people knew was that Amara's assignment to investigate Milbrook County wasn't random. After years of complaints about disparate sentencing and civil rights violations, the Justice Department had finally authorized a comprehensive investigation, and Amara had requested the assignment. Her exceptional record and personal connection to the community made her the perfect choice, though she had disclosed her family history to her supervisors to avoid any appearance of conflict. The Justice Department's preliminary analysis had revealed disturbing patterns. Black defendants in Judge Whitfield's courtroom received sentences averaging 40% longer than white defendants for identical crimes. Civil complaints against local law enforcement were dismissed at alarming rates, and a network of judges, prosecutors, and police officers appeared to be operating with impunity, protected by a code of silence that had persisted for generations. Amara's challenge wasn't just gathering evidence, it was penetrating a closed system designed to protect itself. As she climbed the courthouse steps, she knew that what awaited her inside wasn't just a hostile judge, but an entrenched power structure that would fight to survive. Her investigation would need to be flawless, her resolve unshakable. Because in Milbrook County, justice wasn't just blind, it had been deliberately looking the other way for decades. 2 weeks earlier, in the glass-walled conference room of the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division in Washington, D.C. Division Chief Marcus Bennett had slid a thick file across the table to Amara. "The Milbrook County situation has reached critical mass," he explained, his voice grave. "We've received over 50 complaints in the past year alone, 3 suspicious deaths in custody, sentencing disparities that defy any legitimate explanation, and a judge who seems to think he's running his own kingdom." Amara opened the file, her heart rate quickening as she saw the name Judge Robert Whitfield. "We need our best investigator on this," Bennett continued. "Someone who understands the South, who can navigate the complexities without creating unnecessary friction. Someone who can build an airtight case." Amara looked up from the file. "I grew up there. My father was wrongfully convicted there." Bennett nodded. "I know. That's why I'm giving you the choice. Some might see it as a conflict, but I see it as motivation for thoroughness. If you can maintain objectivity, your connection to the community could be invaluable." The opportunity represented everything Amara had worked toward, a chance to transform a broken system to honor her father's memory through justice rather than vengeance. After a moment's reflection, she nodded. "I'll take the case, but I want a full team: data analysts, forensic accountants, and at least 2 additional investigators." Bennett smiled. "Already approved. This investigation has the highest priority. The Attorney General herself is watching this one." Amara assembled her team with meticulous care. Zoe Ramirez, a brilliant data analyst who could find patterns in seemingly unrelated cases. Marcus Washington, a former FBI agent with decades of experience in corruption investigations. And Tyler Chin, a forensic accountant who had helped bring down corrupt judges in 3 previous cases. In Amara's temporary office in Birmingham, 40 miles from Milbrook County, the walls were soon covered with charts, timelines, and photographs. The team established a secure database to analyze 20 years of case records, looking for patterns in sentencing, dismissals, and judicial decisions. "We need to approach this from multiple angles," Amara explained during their first strategy session. "Official records will tell one story, but we need the human element. 2 former defendants' attorneys who practice in his courtroom, court personnel who've witnessed his behavior." The team developed a 3-phase plan: first, comprehensive data analysis to establish patterns; second, confidential interviews with witnesses; and finally, direct observation and interaction with the court system. They would build their case methodically, leaving no room for claims of bias or insufficient evidence. Remember, Amara cautioned her team, "We're not just investigating one judge. We're examining an entire system. Be prepared for resistance at every level." Amara's first direct encounter with Judge Whitfield's courtroom came sooner than planned. A confidential informant, a clerk in the court administrator's office, had tipped her off about a high-profile case: a young black man named Darius Johnson, accused of assaulting a white police officer during a traffic stop. Dashcam footage suggested the officer had been the aggressor, but the prosecutor was pushing for maximum charges. "This is exactly the kind of case where the disparities are most visible," Amara told her team. "I need to observe firsthand." On a Tuesday morning, Amara slipped into the back of courtroom 7 dressed conservatively and carrying only a small notebook. She watched as Judge Whitfield systematically undermined the defense, sustaining every prosecution objection while dismissing defense motions without consideration. When Darius's public defender attempted to introduce the dashcam footage, Whitfield declared it irrelevant to the charges at hand. During a recess, Amara approached the defense attorney in the hallway, discreetly introducing herself and offering her card. "I can't be seen talking to you," the young attorney whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "But things are worse than you know. Check the sentencing in State v. Harrison and compare it to State v. Donovan. Same crime, same evidence, different outcomes." Before Amara could respond, a court officer approached. "Judge Whitfield doesn't allow loitering in the hallways during recess," he said coldly. Returning to her team that evening, Amara added 2 new cases to their investigation board. "We've got our first lead," she said, "and confirmation that the problem is exactly what we suspected." What she didn't mention was the chill she'd felt when, just before leaving the courtroom, she'd caught Judge Whitfield watching her with narrowed eyes, as if trying to place her face in his memory. Amara's team worked with remarkable efficiency. Within days, Zoe had compiled statistical evidence that was impossible to ignore. In drug possession cases, white defendants received probation 74% of the time, while black defendants with identical charges and similar criminal histories received jail time in 68% of cases. In assault cases, the sentencing disparity averaged 3.2 years. "It's not subtle," Zoe explained, pointing to her charts. "The pattern holds across every category of crime we've analyzed. And it's not just Whitfield, though. He's the worst offender. It's systemic throughout the county's judicial system." Meanwhile, Marcus had begun conducting discreet interviews with former defendants and their families, building a human narrative to complement the statistical evidence. The stories were heartbreaking: families devastated by excessive sentences, lives derailed by judicial decisions that seemed predetermined by race rather than evidence. Tyler's financial investigation uncovered another disturbing pattern. A private prison company had made substantial contributions to Judge Whitfield's election campaigns, and the judge owned stock in the company through a family trust. Every harsh sentence directly benefited his financial interests. "This goes beyond bias," Tyler said grimly. "This is corruption, plain and simple." By the end of the first week, word of the investigation had begun to spread through Milbrook County. Amara received a call from Elijah Jackson, editor of the Milbrook Advocate, the county's black-owned weekly newspaper. "People are talking about your team's presence," Jackson said. "Some are hopeful, others are nervous. Judge Whitfield has friends in high places." Amara arranged a confidential meeting with Jackson, who provided valuable historical context. Whitfield's father was a segregationist state senator, he explained. The son presents himself as more moderate, but the outcomes speak for themselves. He's maintained the old system while updating the language. Jackson introduced Amara to Reverend Calvin Turner, pastor of First Baptist Church, and a civil rights leader who had been documenting judicial abuses for decades. From his church office, Reverend Turner shared a meticulously maintained archive of community experiences with the local justice system. "We've been crying out for federal intervention for years," he said, showing Amara thick binders of complaints. "Every black family in this county has a story about Whitfield's courtroom." As community awareness grew, so did public support and public pressure. Local television stations began reporting on the presence of federal investigators. Civil rights organizations offered assistance and additional documentation. A grassroots movement called Justice for Milbrook organized a peaceful rally outside the courthouse. The investigation's first major breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Late one evening, as Amara was reviewing case files in her hotel room, she received a call from an unknown number. "My name is Sarah Miller," a nervous voice said. "I was Judge Whitfield's court reporter for 12 years. I've been following news about your investigation, and there are things you should know." The next morning, in a coffee shop 30 miles from Milbrook, Miller shared her story. She had documented numerous instances of Whitfield making racist comments in chambers, pressuring prosecutors to pursue maximum charges against black defendants, and coordinating with local police to target specific individuals. "He keeps a separate set of notes," Miller explained, her hands trembling around her coffee cup. "In his private chambers, notes about defendants, about attorneys who challenge him, about anyone he considers a problem." Most significantly, Miller revealed that Whitfield and several prosecutors had a system of marking case files with subtle codes to indicate how aggressively to pursue charges based on the defendant's race. "I can prove it," she said, sliding a USB drive across the table. "I made copies of his private calendar showing meetings that never appeared in official records, and I have photographs of the coded files." This evidence provided the justification Amara needed for the next phase of the investigation: direct confrontation with the court system itself. Armed with substantial evidence, Amara prepared to formally notify the Milbrook County courts of the federal investigation and request access to additional records. This would be the first direct challenge to Whitfield's authority, and the moment when resistance would likely intensify. The team prepared meticulously, ensuring all legal documentation was flawless. They coordinated with the FBI field office in Birmingham for additional security measures. Amara rehearsed her approach, knowing that her demeanor and professionalism would be scrutinized. The night before this critical step, Amara called her mother, now living in Atlanta. "I'm close to something important, Mom," she said. "Something that might finally bring some justice for Dad." Her mother's voice was soft but concerned. "Your father would be proud of you, Amara, but he'd also want you to be careful. Those people protected each other then, and they'll protect each other now." Amara thought of her father, his gentle strength, his unwavering belief in justice despite what the system had done to him. "I'm being careful," she assured her mother, "but this needs to be done." The next morning, Amara dressed with particular care in her most authoritative suit, a portfolio of official documents under her arm. As she drove to the Milbrook County Courthouse, she was acutely aware that she was about to cross a threshold. Once she formally presented herself and her investigation to Judge Whitfield, there would be no turning back. Amara arrived at the courthouse at precisely 9:00 a.m., her credentials and federal court orders ready. According to protocol, her first step was to present these documents to the Chief Judge Robert Whitfield before proceeding with the expanded investigation. She was directed to courtroom 7, where Whitfield was hearing motions before the day's trial calendar. As she entered, she immediately sensed the charged atmosphere. Whitfield was berating a young black attorney for a minor procedural error, his tone dripping with condescension. Amara took a seat in the back row, waiting for an appropriate moment to approach. When the court called a brief recess, she made her way to the front where the clerk sat below the judge's bench. "I need to speak with Judge Whitfield on an urgent federal matter," she said quietly, presenting her Department of Justice credentials. The clerk glanced at her ID, then at Amara herself. hesitation evident in his expression. Before he could respond, Judge Whitfield returned to the bench, noticing the interaction. "Is there a problem, Mr. Collins?" he asked the clerk. "This lady says she needs to speak with you about a federal matter." "Your Honor," the clerk replied. Whitfield turned his cold gaze to Amara. "Court is in session, ma'am. Whatever federal business you have can be scheduled through proper channels." Amara stood her ground. "Judge Whitfield, I'm Special Investigator Amara Cole from the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. I have court orders requiring your immediate cooperation with our investigation into judicial practices in this district." A flash of recognition crossed Whitfield's face, quickly replaced by contempt. "Ms. Cole, this courtroom operates on my schedule, not Washington's. If you can't respect the basic protocols of this court, you have no business being here. With all due respect, Your Honor, these orders—" Whitfield cut her off with a bang of his gavel. "I will not have my courtroom disrupted. Bailiff, please escort this woman out. She can make an appointment like everyone else." The bailiff, a large man with an impassive expression, moved toward Amara. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom as she stood her ground. Judge Whitfield, removing a federal investigator presenting lawful court orders, could constitute obstruction of justice, she said calmly, loud enough for everyone to hear. Whitfield's face flushed with anger. "Bailiff, remove her now and confiscate whatever papers she's attempting to serve improperly." As the bailiff took her arm, Amara locked eyes with Whitfield. "This will be noted in my report to the Attorney General," she said, maintaining her composure despite the humiliation of being physically escorted out. Outside the courtroom, the bailiff released her arm, but held out his hand. "The papers, ma'am. These are federal documents, and you have no authority to confiscate them," Amara replied firmly. "Your actions are being recorded and will be reported." The standoff might have escalated further if not for the timely arrival of Marcus Washington, who had been waiting nearby as a precaution. His imposing presence and his own FBI credentials caused the bailiff to reconsider. "This isn't over," the bailiff muttered, before returning to the courtroom. What Amara couldn't have anticipated was how quickly Judge Whitfield would escalate the situation. Within hours, she was served with a county restraining order prohibiting her from entering the courthouse or contacting court personnel. The order, signed by another judge in Whitfield Circuit, cited interference with judicial proceedings and disruptive behavior unbecoming of an officer of the court. "This is unprecedented," Marcus said as they regrouped in their temporary office. "A county judge cannot block a federal investigation with a local restraining order." Amara nodded, already on the phone with the Justice Department's legal team in Washington. "They're trying to buy time," she said. "Whitfield recognized me, I'm sure of it. He knows why I'm here, and he's panicking." The team worked through the night preparing emergency motions to federal court to override the restraining order. By morning, they had their response. Federal Judge Elaine Richardson in Birmingham had issued an emergency injunction invalidating the local order and explicitly authorizing Amara's team to proceed with their investigation. Armed with this new federal order, Amara decided to change tactics. Rather than confronting Whitfield directly again, she would focus on gathering evidence from other sources within the courthouse. The clerk's office, court records, and staff interviews could provide what they needed without a direct confrontation for now. However, As Amara and Tyler approached the courthouse the next morning, they found the entrance blocked by county deputies. "We have orders not to allow you entry, Ms. Cole," the senior deputy stated. "Judge's orders. I have a federal court order that supersedes any local directive," Amara replied, presenting Judge Richardson's injunction. The deputy barely glanced at it. "My orders come from Judge Whitfield, ma'am. Take it up with him." This standoff, local law enforcement defying federal authority, attracted immediate media attention. By noon, news vans had surrounded the courthouse, and the story was breaking nationally. Federal investigator barred from Alabama courthouse despite court order. The pivotal moment came that afternoon when Amara received a call from the Attorney General herself. "This has escalated beyond a local investigation," the AG told her. "Judge Whitfield has just made a critical mistake. By defying a federal court order, he's given us grounds to expand the investigation dramatically. I'm sending a team of federal marshals to ensure your access, and I'm authorizing you to broaden your scope to include obstruction of justice charges." Within hours, U.S. Marshals arrived in Milbrook County, creating a dramatic scene as they escorted Amara and her team into the courthouse. The image of federal marshals protecting a black female investigator from local officials resonated powerfully across the country, drawing parallels to civil rights struggles of the past. The direct intervention of federal marshals marked a turning point in the investigation. With protected access to the courthouse, Amara's team moved quickly to secure records before they could be altered or destroyed. They discovered evidence even more damning than they had anticipated. In Judge Whitfield's chambers, behind a locked cabinet that the marshals opened with a warrant, they found the private records Sarah Miller had described, notebooks documenting 20 years of deliberate discrimination, lists of problem individuals to be targeted, and correspondence with local business interests who benefited from the county's mass incarceration policies. Most disturbing was a folder labeled Cole J., containing documents related to her father's case. Margin notes in Whitfield's handwriting revealed that he had deliberately suppressed exculpatory evidence and coached witnesses to secure the conviction, knowing James Cole was innocent. As Amara held these documents proof of the injustice that had destroyed her father's life, she felt a complex surge of emotions, vindication, grief, and a renewed determination to see the case through to its conclusion. The investigation now expanded beyond Whitfield to include prosecutors, law enforcement officials, and other judges implicated in the documents. What had begun as an examination of sentencing disparities had uncovered a criminal conspiracy spanning decades. National media coverage intensified, with Milbrook County becoming the focal point of a renewed conversation about systemic racism in the justice system. Civil rights leaders descended on the small Alabama community. Protesters gathered daily outside the courthouse, their numbers growing as more details emerged. Through it all, Amara maintained her professional focus, building a methodical case that would be unassailable in court. She was no longer just an investigator. She had become the public face of a movement for judicial accountability. The final turning point came when 3 of Whitfield's colleagues, seeing the mounting evidence, began cooperating with the investigation in exchange for leniency. Their testimony confirmed what the document suggested: a coordinated effort to maintain a 2-tiered system of justice based on race, with financial incentives tied to incarceration rates. As the investigation entered its final phase, Amara prepared for what would be the most challenging confrontation, a formal deposition of Judge Whitfield himself. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Whitfield had refused to resign and continued to proclaim his innocence, claiming he was being targeted for political reasons. The Justice Department had convened a special grand jury in Birmingham to consider indictments against Whitfield and 23 other officials implicated in the conspiracy. Amara would present the case personally, the culmination of months of intensive investigation. In preparation, she meticulously organized the evidence into 3 categories: statistical proof of systematic discrimination, documentary evidence of corrupt intent, and testimony from victims and witnesses. Her presentation would leave no room for doubt about the scale and impact of the corruption. The night before the grand jury presentation, Amara visited her father's grave in the small cemetery outside Milbrook. She placed fresh flowers beside his headstone and sat for a long moment in silent communion. "Tomorrow's for you, Dad," she whispered, "and for everyone else who never got justice in that courthouse." Despite her thorough preparation, Amara faced a moment of doubt as the grand jury proceedings began. Judge Whitfield had hired a powerful defense team, including former federal prosecutors and a prominent civil rights attorney who argued that the investigation was politically motivated. More concerning was the pressure being applied behind the scenes. Several senators had called the Attorney General, expressing concerns about the investigation's impact. Local officials warned of community unrest if Whitfield was indicted. Even within the Justice Department, some questioned whether pursuing a case against a sitting judge would undermine public confidence in the judiciary. During a tense conference call with Justice Department leadership, Amara defended the investigation's integrity. "This case isn't about politics," she argued. "It's about justice. The evidence is overwhelming and speaks for itself. If we back down now, we're sending a message that some people are still above the law." The Attorney General, after a long pause, gave her decision, "Present your case, Investigator Cole. Let the grand jury decide based on the evidence." As Amara prepared to enter the grand jury room, she received one final challenge, an anonymous note delivered to her hotel room that simply read, "Walk away or regret it." The implicit threat only strengthened her resolve. The grand jury proceedings lasted 5 days, during which Amara presented a comprehensive case that left many jurors visibly moved. Victims of Whitfield's corrupt practices testified to lives derailed by excessive sentences. Former court employees described the toxic culture of racism and intimidation. Financial experts traced the money flowing from private prisons to Whitfield's family trusts. On the final day, in an unusual but powerful move, Amara presented the evidence regarding her father's case not as a personal vendetta, but as the clearest example of how Whitfield's corruption had destroyed innocent lives. James Cole was sentenced to 15 years for a robbery he did not commit. She told the grand jury, her voice steady despite her emotion. The real perpetrator confessed 3 years later, but Judge Whitfield, then a prosecutor, buried that confession. Mr. Cole was eventually released, but died just 2 years later, his health destroyed by his time in prison. She placed her father's photograph on the evidence table. "This case is not about one man or one family. It's about hundreds of families who suffered similar injustices. It's about a system that betrayed its most fundamental purpose, equal justice under law. While the grand jury deliberated, Milbrook County held its collective breath. The courthouse square filled with citizens awaiting the decision. Supporters of Whitfield on one side, advocates for reform on the other, with a heavy police presence between them. After 14 hours of deliberation, the grand jury returned their decision indictments against Judge Robert Whitfield on 47 counts, including civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, racketeering, and corruption. 19 other officials were also indicted, including prosecutors, court officers, and 2 other judges. The indictments sent shockwaves through the Alabama legal community and made national headlines. Within days, the state's Judicial Inquiry Commission suspended Whitfield pending resolution of the charges, and the governor established a special commission to review every case over which Whitfield had presided. For Amara, however, the most meaningful victory came in a small ceremony at the Justice Department in Washington. The Attorney General personally presented her with 2 documents, an official commendation for her work on the investigation and a posthumous exoneration for James Cole, clearing his name completely and acknowledging the miscarriage of justice he had suffered. "Your father's case was the beginning of this journey," the Attorney General said, "but the impact of your work extends far beyond one family or one courthouse. You've created a template for judicial accountability that we'll be implementing nationwide." As cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, Amara thought of her father's words, "Don't seek revenge, seek justice." She had honored that request in the most meaningful way possible. The final moment of victory came 3 months later, when Amara returned to Milbrook County Courthouse not as an investigator, but as the newly appointed Special Overseer for Judicial Reform, tasked by the federal court with implementing comprehensive changes to ensure equal justice. Her office would be in the same building where her father had been wrongfully convicted, where Judge Whitfield had once ruled with impunity, and where she had been humiliatingly ejected just months before. As she climbed the courthouse steps, flanked by her team and greeted respectfully by the same court officers who had once barred her entry, Amara reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The system hadn't changed overnight, and much work remained, but a significant crack had appeared in the edifice of injustice. Inside the courthouse had been transformed. New signs in multiple languages explained citizens' rights. A diverse group of court advocates helped people navigate the system. Monitors displayed real-time data on case outcomes, ensuring transparency in judicial decisions. Amara's new office was on the top floor, formerly Judge Whitfield's private domain. As she settled behind the desk, she placed 2 photographs side by side, her father in his Sunday best, smiling despite everything he had endured, and her mother at her law school graduation, beaming with pride. Between them, she placed a small framed quote that had guided her throughout the investigation. "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." In Milbrook County, that arc had finally begun to bend, and Amara Cole had been the force behind that change. The immediate aftermath of the Milbrook County investigation created ripple effects throughout the Alabama judicial system. Within 6 months, 5 other counties had requested similar federal reviews of their courts, leading to additional reforms and several resignations. The state legislature, responding to public pressure, passed the Judicial Transparency Act, requiring courts to publish sentencing data categorized by race, gender, and economic status. The act also established an independent review board with the power to investigate complaints against judges, a direct result of the systemic failures exposed in Milbrook. For the individuals directly affected by Whitfield's corruption, the impact was profound and personal. The review commission established by the governor ultimately overturned over 300 convictions and reduced sentences in hundreds more cases. Families torn apart by excessive incarceration were reunited. Communities began the long process of healing. Sarah Miller, the court reporter whose evidence had been crucial to the case, received a Whistleblower Protection Award and began working with judicial watchdog organizations to train court personnel to recognize and report misconduct. Judge Whitfield himself, facing overwhelming evidence and the testimony of former colleagues, eventually accepted a plea deal, guilty to 12 counts in exchange for a 15-year sentence, ironically the same length as James Cole's wrongful imprisonment. The image of Whitfield in handcuffs being led from the courthouse, where he had once reigned supreme, became a powerful symbol of accountability. The long-term impact of Amara's investigation extended far beyond Milbrook County or even Alabama. The case became a blueprint for similar investigations across the country, as the Justice Department established a specialized unit focused on judicial accountability using the methodologies Amara had developed. Law schools incorporated the Milbrook case into their ethics curriculum. Judicial training programs added new components on implicit bias and structural racism. The statistical tools developed by Amara's team to identify disparities in sentencing became standard practice in court monitoring nationwide. Perhaps most significantly, the case sparked a national conversation about the intersection of race and justice that transcended political divisions. Conservative legal scholars joined progressive activists in recognizing that equal treatment under the law was not a partisan issue, but a constitutional imperative. For Amara personally, the investigation defined her career. She was appointed to lead the Justice Department's new Judicial Integrity Unit, where she could implement systemic reforms on a national scale. Her methodical approach to exposing corruption while maintaining the highest ethical standards made her a role model for a new generation of civil rights attorneys. 3 years after the investigation, Amara was nominated to the federal bench, the youngest federal judge in the district's history. At her confirmation hearing, senators from both parties praised her commitment to equal justice and her demonstrated ability to address systemic problems without becoming partisan. On the 5th anniversary of the Milbrook investigation, Amara returned to First Baptist Church, where Reverend Turner had maintained his archives of judicial abuses for decades. The church was hosting a community celebration of the changes that had transformed the county's justice system. The pews were filled with families who had been directly impacted by the reforms, people who had received fair sentences, children reunited with parents who had been unjustly incarcerated, young people who now saw career possibilities in law enforcement and the courts that they had previously distrusted. As Amara took the podium, she saw her mother in the front row sitting beside Reverend Turner and Elijah Jackson from the Milbrook Advocate. The community that had shaped her, that had suffered together, and now was healing together, had gathered to commemorate not just what had been overcome, but what had been built in its place. 5 years ago, Amara began, I came back to Milbrook County carrying my father's memory and a commitment to justice that he instilled in me. What I found was corruption and resistance, but also courage and hope from the court reporter who risked everything to tell the truth to the community members who never stopped demanding better. She gestured to the diverse crowd before her. Look at what we've built together. A justice system that's transparent and accountable. Courts where everyone is truly equal under the law. A community where trust is being restored day by day. Amara held up a small worn Bible, her father's Bible, which had sustained him during his wrongful imprisonment. My father used to tell me that justice isn't just about punishing wrongdoing. It's about restoring what was broken. It's about healing. And that's the work we continue today. As applause filled the church, Amara looked out at the community that had come so far. The journey hadn't been easy, and the work wasn't finished. But in Milbrook County, Alabama, a fundamental truth had been affirmed that systems built on injustice, no matter how entrenched, could be changed when people of courage stood together and demanded better. And it had all begun with a moment of disrespect, a racist judge dismissing a black woman who turned out to be exactly the person with the power, the determination, and the moral authority to hold him accountable. In that moment of confrontation, the long arc of the moral universe had begun another bend toward justice.